What's up, everyone? Before we explore today's topic, I want to share some important educational disclaimer information. This video provides educational information about ancestral trauma patterns and is intended for informational purposes only. The content is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any medical or psychological condition, nor should it be used as a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. So, if you are experiencing symptoms of trauma, depression, anxiety, or other mental health concerns, please seek guidance from a qualified mental health professional or healthcare professional. That might also be someone who is a licensed therapist or a medical doctor. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your treatment plan. And while this video discusses various research findings and approaches, no claims are made about specific treatment outcomes. Individual experiences are going to vary greatly, and what research observes in studies may not always apply to everyone. This information should not replace professional medical or psychological care. I am a licensed psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and wellness coach. However, this video does not constitute a therapeutic relationship or professional consultation. For personalized guidance, please schedule a formal consultation with a qualified professional. So, before we dive into today's content, I want to let you know that I re-recorded versions of my ancestral trauma video. I had an earlier version available on the YouTube channel that covers this specific and similar topics, but I've created a new version so that I'm in full compliance with YouTube and advertising policies. So this updated version focuses specifically on the educational content and research findings, with all the appropriate disclaimers and professional guided recommendations. I'm hoping the compliant version will allow me to just share this important educational information with a wider audience through promotion. So let's get started. I want to start with a single image, something simple that might help you understand what researchers are discovering about ancestral trauma patterns. So just imagine you're walking through a beautiful garden and you notice that there are some plants that just seem to be struggling in a particular area. Even though the soil looks healthy and they're getting plenty of water and enough sunlight, when you even dive deeper, you discover that the soil in those areas, in that particular area, that maybe there were traces of old chemicals from decades ago, substances that are still affecting the plant's growth today, even though they were applied long before these particular plants were even ever going to be planted. You see, this metaphor helps us to understand what researchers are finding out about ancestral trauma patterns. According to researcher Dr. Rachel Yehida at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, trauma experiences can create changes that are passed down through generations, affecting people who never directly experienced the original trauma themselves, like the image of the plant I just described earlier. It was even in Dr. Stephen Farmer's, in his research on ancestral family patterns, where he describes these physical, emotional, behavioral, and mental traits, both positive and negative, that you have inherited from your ancestors, that you carry in your DNA, even in your soul. He suggests that we consider the historical context in which they lived and the secrets they kept. This can help tell you a lot about who you are. Taking the time to contemplate your heritage can really open your eye to the unseen forces that have shaped you, forces that stretch back not just through your lifetime, but through centuries, even millennia. So today we're going to explore what researchers have discovered about these ancestral trauma patterns. We're going to examine the scientific evidence for intergenerational trauma transmission, and we're going to look at various approaches suggest about understanding these patterns. Now, this is an educational content designed to help you understand research findings, not to provide these treatment recommendations. Let me clarify. So, let me share what researchers have discovered about how trauma might be transmitted across generations, because understanding the science helps us to recognize this as a documented phenomenon with really measurable biological markers. So let's get back to Dr. Rachel Yehida's research on Holocaust survivors and their children, which really has some of the most compelling evidence for intergenerational trauma transmission. Her studies, published in journals like Biological Psychiatry, found that children of Holocaust survivors showed specific stress hormone patterns and genetic markers that were different from the control groups. Even these children had never experienced Holocaust themselves. The research suggests that trauma can create what scientists called epigenetic changes, modifications in how genes are expressed without changing the actual DNA sequence. Wow. Think of it like a bookmark in a book. The words don't change, but certain pages become marked for easy access. In Dr. Yehida's studies, they really found that trauma survivors have specific patterns of gene expression related to stress response, and some of these patterns appeared in the children as well. Research published in the American Journal of Psychiatry even found similar patterns in other populations. Studies of descendants on slavery survivors, Native American communities affected by historical trauma, even survivors of other genocides, has shown evidence of intergenerational trauma transmission. So, Dr. Maria Yella Horse's work on Native American historical trauma is just another example, where it is well documented how historical losses continue to affect even contemporary Native American communities. In Dr. Joy Guru's research on post-traumatic slave syndrome, this is where it suggests that trauma of slavery may have created these patterns that even continue to affect African American communities today. And we're currently in 2025. Her work examines how centuries of trauma might influence contemporary behaviors, beliefs, even stress responses. You know, what's particularly interesting is that this research suggests trauma transmission isn't just psychological. It appears to involve these measurable biological changes. Studies have found the differences in stress hormonal levels, even immune system functioning, even the brain structure in descendants of trauma survivors. However, it's important to note that research in this field is still developing, and scientists continue to study exactly how these processes work. Individual examples are going to vary, and having ancestors who experience trauma doesn't always mean someone will definitely experience specific traumas or patterns. So I want to make that as an important note. In Dr. Stephen Farmer's research, where it really identifies different levels of family secrets that really contribute to ancestral trauma patterns, understanding these categories can help us really recognize patterns that might exist in family systems, though it's important to remember that this is an educational information opportunity. It is not a diagnostic criteria, right? So, according to Dr. Farmer's framework, family secrets really exist in different degrees of impact. The first degree involves, let's say, the most serious secrets, those involving criminal activities like violence, assault, and sexual crime. Research suggests that these types of family secrets can create the most significant intergenerational effects, as they often involve severe trauma that may not have been processed or addressed at all. Then there is the second degree, and these involve secrets about behaviors that are potentially dangerous, though maybe not necessarily criminal. They might include things like substance abuse, eating disorders, gambling addictions, and identity issues related to adoption and paternity questions. While these secrets might be less than, let's say, our first degree secrets, researchers suggest that they still create family stress and communication patterns that are going to potentially affect multiple generations. Then there's the third degree, involving secrets that can damage trust. That's important. And communication within families. Now, these might include unclear family roles and boundaries, marital secrets, hidden resentments, mental illness that was not discussed, or denial about death or illness. Research indicates that these patterns can create family environments where open communication is difficult and emotional needs may not be adequately addressed. That brings us to the fourth degree, and what research calls toxic shame. Feelings of guilt, fear, anxiety, and depression that become these family patterns, as well as cultural shame about body image, social situations, or spiritual and religious struggles. So it's important to understand that these categories are research frameworks for understanding family patterns, and they're not a diagnostic tool. Many families have some level of secrets or difficult histories, and having family secrets doesn't always mean someone will experience specific problems. However, research suggests that underlying these patterns can sometimes help us make sense of unexplained family dynamics or personal struggles. Research has documented on ancestral trauma patterns is different across cultures and in historical contexts. So understanding these broader patterns can really help us recognize that ancestral trauma is not limited to, let's say, a particular group or a particular time period. The Holocaust research by Dr. Rachel Yehida has provided us, let's say, extensive documentation on intergenerational trauma transmission. Studies have found that children, even the grandchildren of these Holocaust survivors, show significant stress response patterns, even when they grew up in safe environments and were never told of their family's experience. Then there's research on slavery's intergenerational effects. And according to Dr. Joy DeGuro, the work on post-traumatic slave syndrome, that's where it suggests these centuries of traumas really contribute and influence African-American communities through these patterns of stress response, family dynamics, even community relationships. Now, the Native American historical trauma research, really pioneered by Dr. Marie Yellow's work, has documented how these historical losses, including genocide, forced relocation, boarding schools, experiences, even cultural suppression, continue to affect contemporary Native American communities through what researchers call the historical trauma response. So there are studies of other populations even finding similar patterns. Research on descendants of American genocide survivors, the Irish famine survivors, which I'm a part of, and survivors of various wars and conflicts really have suggested that major historical traumas can create these intergenerational effects, and they really persist for multiple generations. Even immigration trauma research has found that stressed on forced migration, cultural loss, and adaptation challenges can create patterns that affect immigrant families for generations. Wow. especially considering what's going on in the US in 2025 regarding our immigration issues and concerns. Studies suggest that even when immigration is voluntary, the stress of cultural transmission can create these lasting family patterns. And you can read didactic information of people's stories that have migrated from one place to another, just to hear how that type of information can be transmitted. Can you imagine the stories that are not shared? War trauma research has documented these intergenerational effects in families from veterans of various conflicts. There are even studies that suggest combat trauma can affect not only the veteran itself, but also the spouses and the children, sometimes creating these patterns that persist even when the original trauma is never discussed. And this brings me to families and law enforcement. So maybe some of this is a consideration that may apply to your life. So if you have someone in a family who is in a law enforcement, how that impacts the spouses and how that impacts the children. You know, it's important to note that research findings describe these general patterns being observed in population study. They're not predictions about individual experiences. So I don't want to create more trauma by listening to this talk. Many people from families with historical trauma may not experience specific symptoms, and individual resilience, family support, and so many other factors can significantly influence the outcome. I want to share with you a story that really is how this stuff can manifest in someone's life. I'm going to call this person David. And David really is a composite example, really used for educational purposes and also to protect confidentiality while demonstrating these concepts and how we can really understand them from a human experience. David came from a family history of immigration trauma and war experiences that were never discussed. His grandparents had survived significant historical trauma, but these families the family stories focus not only on the strengths and success and building a new life. That was it. David never found himself struggling with things like unexplained anxiety or difficulty trusting others or persistences that something terrible was going to happen to him. Even though his own life had been relatively stable, he still kind of had these issues. What was puzzling for David was that these feelings seemed to have no clear source in his own experience. You know, there are traditional approaches that focus only on the personal history, weren't really fully addressing his concerns because they didn't take in the possibility that some of his stress responses might be related to these inherited patterns. So working with a therapist who really understands intergenerational trauma is going to be important. David began to explore his family history and the possible connections between his symptoms, and his ancestral experiences. Research suggests that this type of exploration, when done with appropriate professional guidance, can sometimes help someone understand that patterns that they may not all the way kind of consider. It might seem mysterious. Through the educational process, David learned about his family's historical experience and really began to understand how trauma responses might be transmitted across generations. He discovered that his grandparents had experienced the significant losses and threats to their safety, and that the family had developed patterns of things like hypervigilance and emotional survival, or actually emotional suppression, because they were survival strategies using. So by understanding these patterns, it didn't automatically resolve David's symptoms, but it provided a framework for understanding them that felt more complete than, let's say, some of the prior approaches. Research suggests that this type of understanding can sometimes be as helpful as part of a comprehensive approach to addressing anxiety and trauma responses. David's exploration involved learning about his family's cultural background, understanding the historical context of those experiences, and recognizing how survival strategies that were adapted, let's say for his grandparents, might be less helpful in the current environment. So it's important to emphasize that David's experience represents one individual's experience with professional guidance. This isn't something he did on his own, and that outcomes are going to vary from person to person. But what was helpful for David may not necessarily be helpful for others. Although it may be helpful, this type of exploration should only be done with a qualified professional expert. Research suggests that addressing these ancestral trauma patterns really can benefit from a comprehensive approach that considers multiple aspects of, let's say, the human experience. While individual needs are going to vary, studies have examined various components that might be helpful when working with a qualified professional. Some research focuses on developing awareness of family patterns and distinguishing between these inherited responses and current reality. And then there's studies that suggest that understanding the differences between past and present threats can sometimes help people develop more appropriate responses to current situations. It brings me to think of the research on self-compassion and some of the work by Dr. Kristen Neff. And this kind of suggests that developing an understanding and kindness towards oneself can be helpful for people dealing with inherited trauma patterns. Studies indicate that self-compassion practices might help people understand their responses really as normal reactions to these really abnormal ancestral experiences rather than a personal failing. Trauma processing research, things associated with somatic therapies, psychodynamic therapies, even some work on EMDR suggests that addressing stored trauma responses in the body and nervous system can be helpful for some people. However, this type of work should only be undertaken by a qualified trauma specialist. Research on stress regulation suggests these activities could involve things like animals and nature and play, really to help regulate these stress hormones and the nervous system response. Studies indicate that these activities might be particularly helpful for people whose ancestral trauma involve things like suppression of nature, joy, spontaneity. And then even in the field of nutrition, and nutrition research suggests that trauma can affect our eating patterns and relationships with food across generations. Some studies indicate that addressing nutritional health and developing healthy relationships with nourishment might be a helpful component in this comprehensive approach. And that being said, then there's movement and exercise research really suggests that physical activity can help process stored trauma responses and regulate those stress hormones. Studies indicate that these gentle, mindful movement practices might be particularly helpful for people dealing with inherited trauma patterns. Social connection research consistently shows that healthy relationships, community support are really important factors in trauma recovery. Studies suggest that building supportive relationships and learning healthy communication skills can be particularly important for people whose ancestral trauma involves things like social isolation and family communication difficulties. I hope you kind of see, like, if there's an issue, how things can be addressed through that. So it's really crucial to emphasize that these research findings describe these general patterns observed in studies, and they're not treatment recommendations for specific individuals. So any exploration of these approaches should be undertaken by a qualified healthcare professional who really can give you those personalized one-on-one guidance specific to your needs. Research suggests that when people address ancestral trauma patterns with appropriate professional support, that effects may extend beyond the individual. I love this part. Studies indicate that trauma recovery can have positive effects on family relationships, work performance, and the ability to support others. Some research suggests that people who address their own ancestral trauma patterns may become even more effective advocates for others dealing with similar issues. There are studies that indicate that this type of personal work can really increase empathy and understanding for others who are struggling with these inherited patterns. Help yourself, you can help others in ways that research is kind of supporting. Even research on intergenerational healing suggests that when one family member addresses ancestral trauma, that it creates opportunities for other family members to explore these patterns as well. Studies indicate that children who grow up with parents who have addressed ancestral trauma might be less likely to experience similar patterns themselves. Help yourself, help your kids. Research even suggests that addressing ancestral trauma can lead to a different relationship with culture and spiritual identity. Studies indicate that people might develop a more nuanced understanding of their heritage that really honors both the strengths and the challenges of their ancestral experiences. However, it is important to note that these research findings describe general patterns observed in studies, not guaranteed outcomes for individuals. So recovery experiences vary greatly, and many factors influence how addressing ancestral trauma might affect someone's life and relationships. If you recognize patterns in this educational context that seem maybe relevant to your own experience, it's important to know that professional support is available. Research is constantly showing us how that we as a working professional can really understand these intergenerational traumas so that we can be helpful for people who want to explore these patterns. The first step, that research recommendation, is always education, learning about intergenerational trauma and recognizing that unexplained symptoms and patterns might have ancestral components. Many people report that simply understanding these concepts can really help them to make sense of their experiences that previously seemed so mysterious. The second step involves finding appropriate professional help. Now, this might include therapists trained in intergenerational trauma or support groups for people exploring family problems or family patterns, maybe a little bit of both, or other qualified healthcare professionals who can kind of understand these concepts. Research suggests that exploring ancestral trauma patterns should be undertaken carefully and with appropriate support. Studies indicate that this type of exploration can sometimes bring up these really intense emotions and memories, and professional guidance is important for navigating these experiences safely. So, if you're interested in learning more about whether professional support might be helpful for exploring these patterns, I offer a free 15-minute consultation where we can discuss your specific interests and explore whether these therapeutic approaches might be appropriate for you. As a licensed psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and a wellness coach, I do work with people who are interested in understanding intergenerational patterns. However, this video does not establish a therapeutic relationship. The individual consultation is necessary in order to get that personalized guidance. Remember that exploring ancestral trauma patterns is really not linear. Research suggests that this type of work often involves periods of discovery, integration, and sometimes temporary increases in emotional intensity as patterns are explored. So that is why professional support can help you navigate these experiences really in a safe way and in an effective way. Before I close, I want to share some important mental health information. If you are experiencing thoughts of self-harm, please contact the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 988 or text HOME, HOME, to 741-741 for the crisis text line. For general mental health support, the SAMHSA number, national hotline number is 1-800-662-4357, and it does provide 7 days a week treatment referral services. For those interested in learning more about the intergenerational trauma, reputable resources might be included with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and peer-reviewed research databases like PubMed, where you can find scientific studies on the topic. Remember, this video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical, psychological, or therapeutic advice. The research findings discussed represent general patterns observed in studies, not predictions about individual experiences. Individual experiences may vary greatly, and professional consultation is recommended for anyone interested in exploring these patterns and dealing with trauma symptoms. So, the approaches and concepts discussed should not only be explored with someone, a qualified professional, who can provide these personal guidance based on specific situation and needs. So thank you for joining me for this educational exploration on ancestral trauma research. You can also see the other video, the unedited version of the other video on YouTube. If this information is helpful, please consider subscribing for more educational content about trauma research, intergenerational patterns, and mental health awareness. Like my message, take care of yourself, and remember that seeking professional support is always a sign of strength and courage and a part of self-care.